Welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast. Your chance to learn about the teachings of the Catholic Church on sacred music, both in theory and practice. Through interviews, discussions, and music, your hearts and minds will be lifted up and better understand what it means to sing the praise of His glory. And now, your hosts, Peter Carter and Dr. Jennifer Donaldson.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast. We're joined today by the Director of Sacred Music from St. Charles Seminary in Philadelphia, Dr. Nathan Knutson. He's had experience in music programs all over the country, directing volunteer, professional, and children's choirs, running chant camps, working in diocesan offices of worship, and running cathedral music programs. He brings the unique experience of being intimately involved in both building and organ renovation projects, and even in commissioning and installing a brand new pipe organ. He's someone who not only understands the Church's principles of sacred music, he's an extremely handy and talented guy. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Knutson.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
So the pipe organ is synonymous with the Church in our times, but this wasn't always the case. For example, the Eastern rites of the Church in general make no allowances for the use of instruments in the liturgy, for example, like the organ. And this is in keeping with the tradition of the Church Fathers, who generally saw instruments as too sensual or too deeply associated with pagan practices for use in the Christian liturgy. Indeed, the pipe organ was certainly found primarily in secular contexts, circuses, sporting events, etc., but it was also used in the court of the emperor. Could you tell us a little bit about how the organ made its way into use in the Roman Rite during the first millennium?
Sure. The history of the organ in the Roman West, as with Gregorian chant, is somewhat debated. We do know that organs were found in some of the most important shrines, and you alluded to it in your question, with the royal palaces. For instance, in Paris, we know that there was an organ in the year 580, and monastic use was likely earlier than churches, and the earliest known, at least to my knowledge, was in the ancient monastery of Malmesbury, England. Was installed 100 years later in 680. And then we also know a pipe organ with great leaden pipes, as the quote says, was sent to the West by the Byzantine Emperor Constantine V as a gift to the king of the Franks, Pepin the Short, in about 750. And then in 800, Pepin's son Charlemagne requested another organ for his chapel in Aachen. Kind of really that organ around 812 began the pipe organ's establishment in Western European church music. But in Rome, the first organ was built around the year 880, so several hundred years later, and that was ordered by Pope John VIII. With an organist. He had to actually bring in an organist from Bavaria to play it, because you think, well, organs are new in churches, so he didn't really have anybody that he knew of in Rome that could play it, so he brought someone in.
Much like the parishes of today. No one knows an organist read, so you got to bring one in from Bavaria.
So right around that time, the end of the 9th century, there was a papal bull that was the directive. We could say that would be our standing directive that allowed for the use of the pipe organ in churches. So sometimes you might hear people say, well, the organ wasn't, originally in churches, so why would we use them in churches? But certainly since at least 900, we've had a standing tradition of that, so it's a pretty long standing. And then as we know the history of instrumental music and going along with art and things, that throughout the ages, things just developed alongside art and architecture and choral polyphony and so forth. We grew into that, so the organ changed, as we'll probably talk about.
So how did the earliest organs work, like when they were first starting to be used in the Western churches?
Yeah, I think it's helpful to look at even what it was before that time. So what was the organ initially? To our knowledge, again, we don't know everything about it, but that really the organ is one of the most ancient instruments, and sometimes we don't think like that, but we get it from the ancient Greeks. Often the Greeks will say they invented everything, but they did probably around the 3rd century BC already had something similar to an organ. We call it a hydraulis from the word water, because they used water to power some sort of a vacuum system that used air, and that air, when it released, would blow into a pipe, much like our modern pipe organs. And then, many hundreds of years, thousands of years passed, and then bellows were developed, probably 6th or 7th century AD, that would store that air. But we would still need people to pump the air manually, and that really lasted until our very electronic age of, 100 years ago. So really, it was a slow development if we look at it from that standpoint. But the earliest organs in the church would have probably accompanied, probably very quietly, mainly to sustain the voice. And that's something I'm going to talk about in greater depth. But really keeping in mind, of course, that church music is and always was primarily vocal to deliver the text, to be a prayer. And so throughout the centuries, the organ would develop into different styles of that, but primarily always centering around the text and the voice. Later developing into alternatum styles, where the organ would actually play strophes of texts in place of the choir, for instance, or like in a strophic hymn. But early on, probably would have been relatively accompanimental and not quite maybe as showy as we think nowadays.
So perhaps this is related to the theological founding for why the West was able to incorporate, from a theoretical standpoint, the organ in the Roman Rite. It was seen as an extension of the human voice because it functions kind of like the human voice. And so it was always related to vocal music and not played as a solo instrument in its founding.
Yes, I think very much that the text comes to the forefront, and that the organ was then added to that, probably to sustain the sound, to sustain the pitch, to make sure the pitch didn't fall. And in our modern time, we think of it maybe as another instrument rather than adding to. Sometimes we want to add different instruments to the Mass, and that's okay. But primarily the organ was seen in that way, that it was added to, and then later it grew out of that tradition to be more of an instrumental solo instrument.
So, for example, when we see the organ being talked about as an instrument in documents of the church, sometimes you'll see the phrase that the organ sings. And of course, we know that the organ isn't human, but it's, again, linked to the voice, which is the primary Christian instrument.
Yes, and that really goes into the mechanics of the organ and how it's actually built and how one uses it with a good understanding. And I hope that's something that I can help people more fully understand today, is that it primarily is a wind instrument, just like our voice. And so we can go through each part of the organ really and can see how it mimics or emulates the human characteristics of our voice. And it really complements it too. It's not just to make it sound exactly the same, because obviously we know the organ has a lot more than just vocal sounding instruments. But to go through the parts of the organ briefly, it uses air, of course. It's probably the most important thing. And that air is produced somehow through a blower, or we could say in our human sense, through our muscles, through our diaphragm. And then the air is passed through our tubes in our lungs, and that could be the organ's reservoirs that hold the air. And then there are metal or wood wind lines in an organ, and that would be kind of like our bronchial, tracheal tubes. And then the pipes themselves are so human in their characteristics. They have toes and feet and mouths and cheeks, and all of those things can be regulated, not only the volume of the air, but the quality of how the air flows through the pipes, just like our human voice. So it really, that's what primarily makes it the best instrument, and the only 100% approved instrument for the Catholic Church is really ties to this notion of how it emulates the human voice.
So another theoretical grounding for the use of the organ in the Roman Rite is, for example, all the mathematical calculations that go into building a pipe organ. It's an incredibly mathematically complex engineering feat. And this was seen as something that was sort of an incarnation of the order of the universe. Like you create an instrument that emulates the order of the universe. And that was inherently attractive to the Christians of the first millennium, who were largely influenced by Neoplatonic thinking that was predominantly ruled by thinking about number, order, harmony, and the order not only of the cosmos, but the order within our body and the order of relations between God and man.
Yes, that's so interesting, and it ties to the organ really. If one just would step up to a pipe organ, you'll see all these numbers everywhere, and maybe you don't pay attention too much what they mean, but to the human voice, if we would sing or play on a piano or something that has a pitch, we could say that middle C at an 8 foot, so 8 feet of air in a pipe, so the pipe would be 8 feet tall roughly, that would produce the same sound as the human voice would sing middle C. And if we wanted to go higher than that, just like good Pythagoras taught us, we would make the string half as big, so we'd use half as much air, so we'd have a 4 foot pipe that would sound an octave higher, and a 2 foot an octave higher than that. And a 16 foot would be lower, so we could have a 16 foot pipe or a 32 foot pipe, and that's equally octave lower. And then there's also even more numbers. There's fractions that are called mutations, and they produce octave and a fifth, or octave and a sixth, or all sorts of overtone series. And then mixtures are kind of the capstone, we could say. They produce multiple rows of pipes at the same time. So there's such an amazing amount of mathematics to it. And even with just one finger, you can play, 8, 9, 10, 12 pipes at the same time at different pitch intervals.
So changing gears a bit, what are some of the roles the organ plays in the liturgy, and how does its sound quality facilitate an excellent execution of those roles?
Yeah, so some of the liturgical roles that it plays, it's such a varied instrument that's so beautiful to think about all the different styles. It can be a solo instrument, so you hear that primarily in preludes or postludes or interludes, or certainly in improvisation, where a player completely makes up the piece, or maybe has planned a little bit beforehand, but is on the spot making the music and creating. And then there's the choral style, which is providing more of that pitch center I talked about in the early church, but also that came into with composers that the organ served as doubling the voice parts. So it was used to really give the actual pitches, or in some cases, certain voices like the tenors or the basses are weak today or something. So then you'd use the organ to that advantage. But it would also, later especially, and we know this from our modern time, is it would provide a fantastic accompaniment. It would really provide an accoutrement to the mundane, maybe. If you just had a simple hymn or a simple chant or something, you could make it sound a little bit more fantastic.
So perhaps another strong association of people in our time with the organ is as a sort of soundtrack to creepy movies, or with scenes from Andrew Lloyd Webber's Phantom of the Opera. What would you say to someone who finds the sound of the organ spooky or too weird, such that they prefer the sound of something like the piano or guitar at Mass?
Sure. I guess I would say certainly there are many different kinds of organ music. That's kind of the beauty of the instrument, is that you get all sorts of crazy and also very academic approaches, but you get all sorts of fanatics. Maybe they're all geeky in a way, but you get certain different genres of organ music, from silent movies to secular uses, as you mentioned, such as even graduations. That's not really a sacred realm usually, although sometimes we kind of make it sort of a sacred moment, but it's usually outside the church. While an organ is not particularly required for worship, as I spoke about before, it certainly adds a great solemnity, a great splendor, and it can also be very calm and soothing. And I think sometimes organists could develop that methodology more, that maybe if you play loud all the time, maybe you should try to be soft, or or vice versa. Maybe you're more comfortable playing just on your 8-foot stops and you're not very adventurous. So maybe you should work on a toccata for Pentecost or something that's coming up. So sometimes we fall into the danger, and I know I do myself, that you walk up to the organ, you press piston number 1, and you start playing instead of how can I rethink some of the sounds I'm using or the way I'm playing so that it doesn't always sound like, sometimes people say, a funeral, or it sounds too spooky or so forth. But to answer the other part of your question about the pianos and the guitars, that really, I think many know that the piano is primarily a percussion instrument. It hits the string with a hammer. And it's a relatively modern invention. 1700 sounds like a long time ago, but in comparison to a 3rd century BC instrument, it's pretty new. And also the guitar is, both instruments are seen as, especially in our culture, seen as more of an entertainment instrument and doesn't really associate itself with being sacred. Now we can take those instruments and try to make them sacred, but we really have to make a lot of excuses and do a lot of different things to those instruments to make them suitable, as the church says. So really, those are more campfires in living rooms. We used to think of the piano as an old-fashioned parlor instrument. I don't know if we do anymore, but you still hear it in piano bars or things like that. So it's not really the best instrument for being sacred. Sometimes, too, I think we get into these arguments about instruments, and we really just need to look at what the church says, which primarily, again, it speaks about the organ. It doesn't speak about these other instruments much. So in sacred music, our home base, as we tend to prefer things that make us feel familiar and feel at home, I think that's sometimes why people want the piano or the guitar. They're more comfortable with the instrument themselves, maybe as a player, but they want something that kind of they can kick back and relax. But really, as the church in her wisdom has said, that music is set aside for our Lord. It's not entirely just what we want, but it's about doing and praying. It's about doing what the church has asked us to do and praying the text. So the same thing with the organ, that it sustains and carries its own pitch without need of rolling chords or strumming or any sort of amplification or things that other instruments tend to need.
So, alluding to these statements of the church on the pipe organ, perhaps we could look at what Sacrosanctum Concilium actually says in paragraph 120. So, again, this is the Constitution on the Divine Liturgy from Vatican II. And in this paragraph 120, it says, "In the Latin Church, the pipe organ is to be held in high esteem, for it is the traditional musical instrument which adds a wonderful splendor to the church's ceremonies and powerfully lifts up man's mind to God and to higher things. But other instruments also may be admitted for use in divine worship, with the knowledge and consent of the competent territorial authority, as laid down in Articles 22, 52, 37, and 40. This may be done, however, only on condition that the instruments are suitable or can be made suitable for sacred use, according with the dignity of the temple, and truly contribute to the edification of the faithful." So one of the main reasons we're talking about the pipe organ is not simply because we like it. In fact, you and I are both pianists, and if it came down to someone asking me which instrument I prefer, just without context, I would probably say the piano, because I love it so much. But the church tells us that we are to prefer the organ to other things in the liturgical context. So while the church is clear in speaking about the pipe organ, we're less clear about these other instruments, and that the church says that the instruments are suitable or can be made suitable. Does that simply mean that if you can play it, it works?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I believe that it's something that is on the heartstrings of most parishes. And so maybe it's the case that you don't have an organ, or you have an organ that's sitting there and you have these other instruments, and maybe even have an understanding about the organ and that these other instruments are not as good. Well, I guess we need to have a little more thorough, understanding of how we can help that. So that's, I believe, where the church is going when it immediately says right after the pipe organ, so it's setting up the model for us. And then maybe to the frustration of some, it immediately says, well, you can do these other ones, but you have to make sure that they're okay. It brings to mind, I went to a Spanish Mass one time in a very rural area of southern Minnesota, and there was a very nice Hispanic choir. They had the organ there, and they were a pretty decent organist, but they also had about, I don't know, maybe 10 or 12 guitars. And at first, I made a huge cringe, and I probably shouldn't have. But then they started to play, and they played very quietly. You could hardly hear the guitar. It was very appropriate in the sense that it didn't distract from the text. I don't know necessarily if they needed 12 of them, but it was very quiet and unobtrusive. And I think that's really what the church is going for. Now with the piano, though, we have to be careful, because if we play super quiet with a piano, it can tend to sound like we're being very, I don't know, again, like that piano bar or something like that, where we're making this atmosphere. It's a little bit self-centered. So we have to be careful with the piano. Again, with the rolling chords, that tends to be the style you have to take with a piano, because you don't have the ability to sustain except your little sostenuto pedal. But it's not like the organ where you can simply hold a note or hold a chord and it sustains as long as you have wind. I hope that kind of helps answer the question, but I know it's a very difficult one. I think the main thing that we always need to come back to is the fact that the church has already set up the model instrument being the organ. And then these other instruments should be very much to a lesser degree in use. So if there's ways, and maybe we'll talk about that, but if there's ways to promote the organ in your church and really encourage that and not get into these debates that aren't really that important anyway, because the church is always guiding us back to the pipe organ.
Yeah, I think of a couple of things that need to be borne in mind too when making this decision. If you don't have any organists that sound good, but you have a guitarist that sounds good, it's also a constitutive element of sacred music to be beautiful. And if you can make a beautiful sound with a guitar, and
yes,
the sound with the organ would be horrible, then you probably should choose the guitar.
Yes, but it also doesn't mean that the organist should never take any lessons or try to improve.
Yes.
Sometimes that's the excuse we make as well. The guitar player is so much better, so we'll just have guitar for the next 10 years. Instead of, maybe, as both my wife and I started organ, was from a scholarship, and it was, ages ago, but it was $10 per lesson, times 10 was $100 scholarship. I think most people can afford to do something like that. But that's what got us both started. So I think more opportunities like that. And then also the fact that if your church doesn't even have an organ, how are you supposed to learn about it or be exposed to it? You hear that a lot, that, well, we don't have an organ, or the organ is broken, so there's nobody to play it. Well, but as the old Field of Dreams movie, if you build it, they will come. I think that certainly that's the case with organs. You have to give the opportunities in order for it to grow.
Right. So that leads me to my next question, actually. You've had the opportunity to design and install or even fix up a number of organs in your jobs. But the financial situation of an increasing number of Catholic parishes is that building a new pipe organ or even fixing up a pipe organ is simply unaffordable. What would you say to music directors, pastors, and parishioners in this situation? And can you explain to someone who's not a musician the difference in the quality of sound between a pipe organ and a digital one? In other words, is there really a big difference, and such a big difference that we should go out of our way to really raise a lot of money to buy, install, or fix up a pipe organ instead of just buying a digital one? Why should someone who's not a professional care about this?
Yes, that's an excellent question. I think it's one of the most frequent questions I get from seminarians, from priests, from laity, if you're giving a workshop or things. And it almost always comes down to money, unfortunately. So we'll start there, and then I'll get to the rest of your question. So an electronic organ, particularly a digital one in our modern age, costs a lot more than you think. It's not something where you just pay a little bit and then you're good. Or maybe you find a very cheap electronic one, but then it needs to be fixed. We think about what an electronic organ actually is. It's, especially in the modern age, it's a digital sampling, high-end MIDI components, state-of-the-art electronics. Basically, it's a glorified computer, and we know how long a computer lasts. If you get any computer, you will probably be getting another one in 5 to 7 years or something. So an organ, I've studied this quite a bit, and on average, I'd say an organ lasts maybe 15 or 20 years, which sounds like a lot, and especially to priests, that'll get me through my tenure for sure. So that's, out of my hands. But we should really think about it, spending any sort of money, we should think about it from an investment standpoint that it's going to last into the future. Just like a piece of art, if you buy a beautiful piece of art, whether it's in your home or in your church, it's something that will last for ages and generations to come. Just like a well-built, well-conceived organ will be a generation to come investment. So let's think about just some numbers quick, because I know that the money question is always the hot button issue. If you think about maintenance costs for a pipe organ, so that usually comes up primarily the tuning, you hear $1,000 a year to tune this thing or whatever it is, and that I can just save all that money if I don't have an electronic. I'm sorry to say, but that just isn't true. Recently, I helped a small cathedral make the decision between a pipe organ and an electronic organ. They received a bid for more than $300,000 for an electronic organ. My jaw dropped. But as I said, these things can cost quite a bit more than you might think. So if you say that organ would last 15 years, an electronic organ, without any speaker upgrades or probably electronic failures of some sort, you'll have to have a technician in for those. That's equating about $20,000 per year on this electronic organ that you'll have to pretty much throw out and get a new one. So if we looked, rather than that, we looked at a pipe organ, we might spend, quite a bit more, maybe twice as much, or maybe even 3 times as much at the outset, but the instrument will last at least 5-7 times more. I think the average life expectancy for an organ could easily reach 100 years. I know certainly in my area, there's organs from the 1800s and back. So apart from money, it actually is, you'd only spend, if we equated that out, you'd only spend about $8,000 per year as opposed to the 20. And I suppose you can work numbers however you want, but that's been my experience, and that really worked with this little cathedral. They made the investment. They were easily able to raise the money and then some for maintenance. And you think about, from a pastoral standpoint, that you fix parking lots and you fix roofs and you do a new parish hall or things like that. This is just as much a need, if not greater, because it's for the sacred liturgy, that we would want to give of an instrument that would last for many, many years, rather than just this temporary electronic computer that will just fail.
So can you also wrap in there some differences between the sounds? What would a non-professional hear in the difference between a pipe organ versus a digital organ?
Yes, so primarily the quality of the sound is substantially different because of this idea that I first talked about with the wind pressure, the wind instrument. It uses the same air that we breathe. It's the same air that a candle at the Mass, it uses the same air. It gives us life. There's lots of representations of air in the liturgy, such as the Holy Spirit, the breath blown over the water, and all of these things at baptism and so forth. So we think about that physicality of the air, and that it's reproducing that air into a beautiful sound that helps us sing better. And then secondly, we shouldn't confuse volume with quality. So sometimes we think, well, I'll buy this electronic organ and it'll have big speakers, like maybe 8 speakers, and that's going to fill the church with this loud, maybe electronic produced organ sound, and maybe it sounds the same to you or me, but it really isn't even close to the difference. We have 8 speakers in this, but a pipe organ has hundreds or thousands of little speakers called pipes, and each and every one of them produces its own acoustic, real sound. Just like we could think of an analogy again with the human voice, that if we considered each and every one of those pipes as a human voice, then an average organ would have 1,500 or 2,000 people singing with all those pipes. So I like to think, and I think it's pretty common to think about Psalm 150, Laudate eum in cordis et organo, praise him with strings and pipes. It doesn't say praise him with electronics and computers. So it's actually pretty clear in the scripture, pretty clear in the documents. But then maybe if you aren't able to hear the difference, you just need to think about some of those qualities of it actually uses air, and it can produce all these different amazing sounds. The king of instruments, as Mozart called it, the trumpet, the clarinet, the oboe, the French horn, all those reed instruments, but it can produce tons of flute instruments. The diapason is kind of the human voice mimic, and we have all sorts of levels of pitch we talked about. And then also the strings are kind of that fourth tone family, we could call it, that it's able to produce all these different sounds like an orchestra can, but it only takes the one player to do so.
Right. It would be almost like if you were in a room that was designed for viewing movies and you had, 4 speakers in the front and 4 speakers in the back versus a room where you have thousands of speakers around you and each speaker is capable of making a different sound and specializing in it. And you can imagine how, in fact, this is a new model for the economics of movie theaters, right? Like we don't usually go to a movie theater anymore because that's the most convenient way to see the newest thing. We go for the experience of like this massive amount of sound surrounding us and all these tricks that they can do. Like you can hear a person walking by you and how they run it through these massive speaker systems around them. And that's kind of like what a pipe organ does.
Yes, and I kind of go back to that point about the digital organ because that's what will come up right away as well. A digital organ, and you'll hear this from salesmen, that a digital organ is a reproduction. It's a sampling. It's a dry sampling or a wet sampling. You hear those terms a lot. That someone actually went over to, Saint Sulpice in Paris or wherever, and they recorded that sound. And you can have that actual organ sound in your church. And that's great and everything, but it's still a computer and it's still a reproduction. It's not using real air. It's not making those beautiful pipes soar and sing. It's just a reproduction. So it's not the worst thing in the world to have an electronic organ, but certainly the goal would be at some point to invest in that future instrument that will last a long time.
So to wrap up, if someone is unfamiliar with the vast body of repertoire written for the organ, what would you recommend they listen to that would serve as a good introduction to different types or eras and composers within the repertoire?
Certainly the internet has many recordings of pipe organs, particularly on YouTube and so forth. But I would actually recommend going to organ concerts because, again, it's not a reproduction from your computer speakers, but you're hearing the actual wind yourself. And then there's also kind of a method of actually supporting the artists that way as well, that organ concerts sometimes aren't the best attended events. So it would be good to support your area organists and your area musicians and the choirs who spend their lives learning these instruments. If we think about the trades of, electrical or plumbing or so forth, those people go to school for a few years and then they're trained in their trade. But really, musicians, and Jenny knows as well, that you spend your whole life, you spend hours and hours in school for decades. But then after that, you also continue practicing, you continue studying. And so I would recommend going to concerts. But then secondly, you've certainly heard of composers such as J.S. Bach, probably considered the finest organ composer. But his German confrere, Dietrich Buxtehude, is really worth listening to. Bach walked over 200 miles to hear him play and improvise. So that would be, Buxtehude would definitely be on my list. But then it's almost like going out to eat. You're asking all these types of food we could eat, but all these genres and all these areas around the world that we could listen to. So in the French tradition, definitely would encourage listening to, especially those beautiful, authentically Catholic composers such as Olivier Messiaen and Charles Tournemire and others, not necessarily all French, but other French composers, Franck and Langlais and Duruflé, and probably one of my favorites is Alexandre Guilmant, has beautiful organ works. And then turning to another country again, the Spanish composers such as Domenico Zippoli and English composers like John Stanley or Ray Vaughan Williams. It's hard to select only a few, but We often find, too, that the organists are well known to us, most of the names, because they wrote beautiful choral works as well. And here in America, too, we should listen to American composers such as Leo Sowerby, Dudley Buck, or Paul Mons, or people like that wrote more modern works. And since I mentioned Zipoli, I make a small plug for
Yes, please do.
the Domenico Zipoli Institute. There's actually a very fine organ method that my wife and I worked on. Lisa did most of it. It's primarily teaching organ to seminaries, which is where I teach, and also to religious houses. And the address is domenicozipoli.org/organ. And you can find a little method there. And I've actually used it for teaching laity as well, that there are these 5-minute lessons that are meant to be done every day. Of course, we know practice works best regularly and not just an hour a week or something. But these tiny little lessons, and then you can work on repertoire pieces or hymns or mass settings or things in addition to that. So that's a great resource. And I think certainly there are other resources on the pipe organ out there, especially from the pipe organ guilds, such as the American Guild of Organists and other guilds.
Thanks so much for being with us today, Nate. It was really great to have you on, and what you say is compelling both from a historical perspective, but also from a very practical one. So thanks for sharing your wisdom with us.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for all that Square Notes does. It's a wonderful program.
If you're interested in learning more about the basics of the organ, stay tuned for more details about a class we're offering at St. Joseph's Seminary in Yonkers this summer, entitled Introduction to the Organ for Pianists. You'll learn about good technique, registration, the basics of service playing and accompanying, and work on some repertoire well suited for your proficiency level and pastoral situation. Stay tuned for more details, which will be appearing soon at dunwoody.edu. And Dunwoody is spelled with one N, DUNWOODIE.edu. And until our next episode, may we sing the praise of His glory.
We hope you've enjoyed listening to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast with Peter Carter and Dr. Jennifer Donaldson. For more information about this episode, sacred music resources, or upcoming events, visit our website at sacredmusicpodcast.com. You can subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, SoundCloud, or your favorite podcast app. If you enjoy our podcast, please write us a review on iTunes. This improves our iTunes ranking and helps others find out about the podcast. The music you heard at the beginning of this episode is Hec Dies by William Byrd, sung by the London Oratory's Schola Cantorum Boys Choir, directed by Charles Cole, from the CD Sacred Treasures of England. The music at the conclusion of this podcast is the first movement of Trio Sonata No. 6 in G major by Johann Sebastian Bach, performed by Peter Carter. We look forward to having you join us next time, and until then, may we sing the praise of His glory.